Roots of Britain's difficult relationship with Europe, now on BBC Two, the final part of The Poisoned Chalice.
For much of the last 40 years, the Battle of Waterloo might never have ended. The French and the British have kept on marching against each other. But during the 1990s, both have had to cope with a new factor, a more assertive Germany. And the British have taken a perverse enjoyment in shooting themselves as much as the enemy.
The Tory Civil War had its roots in what was called the Single European Act of 1986. Fairly unremarked at the time, the Act revived the dream of a federal Europe, which in turn swelled the ranks of the Eurosceptics. From the Maastricht Treaty to the advent of the Euro, the endless battle between the British and continental visions of what Europe means continues to claim its victims.
The course of history sometimes turns on apparently trivial things. After the London Summit of 1986, another of those vaguely fractious, inconclusive affairs which European leaders seem to love, Margaret Thatcher, as the host, was due to hold a press conference. By custom, she and her trusty press secretary were joined on the stage by Jacques Delors, the Commission President. He might as well have gone out to dinner. Whatever the question was, the British Prime Minister had the answer.
Our policy on that has not changed.
She answered every question and never let Delors say a word which was not really nice to him.
She quite simply forgot that Monsieur Delors was there.
I missed the beginning of your...
And then when she did finally remember, Delors, I think, was sufficiently miffed by having been hitherto ignored and excluded not to wish to play much part in the proceedings.
Monsieur Delors, I'm sure you'd like to say something about that. If not, would you say it anyway?
No. I am obliged to such a discretion.
And he looked up, waking up. He probably hadn't been listening to the English. So it's quite hard to listen in a different language. And he didn't say anything quite.
You mean you can refuse to talk to them? But would you very kindly confirm that what I said was absolutely, strictly accurate and that you are looking forward to this and rising to the challenge it represents, and you will hope to solve it during your coming 2 years as presidency of the Commission.
Yes. I hope.
She misinterpreted his silence and said...
I had no idea you were such a strong, silent man.
He understood that, and he thought that was a jest at his expense. So that both sides had caused each other offence quite inadvertently.
Delors is the kind of guy who's not pleased with this kind of joke, and he didn't speak.
Je ne voyais pas pourquoi je devrais absolument parler si je n'avais rien d'original à dire. Bien sûr, elle a fait rire la presse ce jour-là.
The tension between them grew worse because of something that happened in, of all places, Bournemouth. Delors came to address the TUC. For years, the unions had been hostile to Brussels, but they'd been hammered by Thatcherism, shunned in the corridors of power. So when Frere Jacques came courting, they jumped into his arms like an old spinster desperate to get hitched.
He was someone who looked like a president or looked like a prime minister. He was sanctifying the TUC in some way just by being there.
Jacques Delors is, of course, making a unique visit to us. But make no mistake about it, friends, Jacques Delors is no pushover. Or as we say in French, il n'est pas un pushover. On y va, on y va, on y va, which, as you know, means here we go, here we go, here we go. Jacques Delors!
He came to persuade the mainstream British left to love Europe. From now on, the most fervent opposition to Europe would come from the right.
Europe is again on the move.
I thought the speech personally was quite stupefyingly dull. Doubtless to Mrs. Thatcher's ears it was positively satanic in its power and range, and the very fact that he was there must have appalled her.
Dear friends, your movement has a major role to play. Europe needs you. Thank you.
J'ai même été surpris par l'accueil que j'ai reçu. Ça ne m'était jamais arrivé en France avec mon parti.
It had a very remarkable effect on the trade union leaders. There they were, reviled and rejected in their own country by their own government, and treated with respect and welcome, even with affection, by the rulers of Brussels.
Colleagues, in the short term, we have not a cat in hell's chance of achieving that in Westminster. The only card game in town at the moment is in a town called Brussels. And it's a game of poker where we've got to learn the rules and learn them fast.
The reaction to Delors' visit to the TUC from Mrs. Thatcher was volcanic or Vesuvian, though that was not unusual as far as Europe was concerned. What really bugged her was seeing the President of the Commission trying to play a political role.
What Mrs. Thatcher didn't realise was that her own Foreign Office, just across the street, had helped to arrange Delors' visit.
The Foreign Office, somewhat cack-handedly, thought that it would be a good idea to improve relations between us and the French, and one way of doing this would be to engineer an invitation from the TUC to have Jacques Delors address their conference, and indeed to try and persuade Jacques Delors to accept the invitation. And that is indeed what happened.
I think we were always willing to help find occasions when he could appear in a hospitable setting with British audiences. We were always anxious to find bridges rather than holes between us.
Of course, so far from improving relations between our Britain and France and Britain and the community, it made things a great deal worse.
How much worse, we would soon find out. But just then, Margaret Thatcher was working on her famous speech at Bruges. It set out her vision of Europe and became the symbol of Tory division. Were you for Bruges or against it?
The Prime Minister had had to return from holiday, which he never minded doing, in order to deal with a crisis in Northern Ireland, and having come back decided not to go away on holiday again, and nor did I. So we had rather more time than usual to sit and reflect on the text of a speech.
Her volcanic reaction to Bournemouth was soon fed into drafts of the speech, which went to and fro between the Foreign Office and Number 10.
There had been initially a very sort of pro-European Foreign Office draft, which Margaret Thatcher had rejected with contempt. There had been then a new draft, which had emanated from Number 10, in which she really spoke from the heart, and it was an extremely xenophobic speech. And, of course, the Foreign Office had kittens, understandably.
The Foreign Office was increasingly reluctant as the awful truth of what was going to emerge in Bruges dawned upon it, and it made some valiant attempts to get the draft changed.
My anxiety was that certain passages which had been, I thought, too abrasive, too rough and striking the wrong note, which we thought we had changed, had reappeared, if anything, in a stronger form.
By the time Thatcher arrived in Belgium, the old smoothies in the Foreign Office had got one or two emollient phrases in the speech, but that wasn't enough.
It was a very good speech. However, Bernard Ingham, who was in charge of the press at Number 10, really gave a gloss, and so the headlines in the tabloid press were of a very cheap, jingoistic nature.
But it was never, ever going to be accepted as other than an attack upon the prevailing norms of Europe. First of all, it was delivered in that temple of federalism in European, some academic institution in Bruges. Secondly, the British press are not capable of nuance in these circumstances. They want a knock-down fight. I'm afraid that is what it was always going to be.
Mr. Chairman, you have invited me to speak on the subject of Britain and Europe. Perhaps I should congratulate you on your courage.
Uh-oh. The audience fastened their seatbelts. Thatcher's takeoff was smooth. Britain had a European destiny and other nice stuff. Then came the turbulent bits which would become the gospel of Euroscepticism.
To try to suppress nationhood and concentrate power at the center of a European conglomerate would be highly damaging and would jeopardize the objectives we seek to achieve.
Elle a noirci le tableau. Elle a voulu diaboliser ma conception de l'Europe et peut-être moi-même. Non, mais elle a toujours été très offensive, c'est son style.
We have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level, with a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels.
Phrases about the superstate at the heart of Europe, decisions being taken by bureaucracy, really challenging all the central institutions of the community. They hadn't been used by heads of government in any country until that time. So they produced a sense of shock and hostility, which, in retrospect, look almost surprising.
I thought it was very dangerous stuff indeed. The tragedy was that if Mrs. Thatcher had remained on a moderate pro-European course, anti-market people would really have been completely marginalized. But it was the Bruges speech that gave them their opportunity.
The lines on the European battlefields were changing. The old order was breaking down. Germany was now dictating strategy. The Single European Act had breathed new life into the long-standing dream of a federal Europe. At the Hanover Summit of 1988, the Continentals wanted to press on to a single currency and suggested a committee could look at how it might work.
Margaret Thatcher was absolutely horrified with this, horrified with the idea of a European central bank, and horrified also quite independently by a committee of experts. She also had a great distrust of independent experts who never have their feet on the ground, have all these airy-fairy ideas, don't understand about practical politics.
The German Chancellor sensed Mrs. Thatcher's discomfort and came up with a different plan.
Chancellor Kohl took Mrs. Thatcher aside into a corner of the room and said, look, if we can entrust this task to some pretty orthodox financiers, and there's nobody more orthodox than central bank governors, they'll see all the problems with it, the difficulties with it. They won't come up with anything very dramatic. It'll be in safe hands there. And Mrs. Thatcher bought that line.
This happened during all the summits, that Chancellor Kohl has to take her aside and to convince her. And this was always part of the game.
But unfortunately, what she did was so pleased at getting this change from the experts, these airy-fairy experts, to the governors of the various central banks, that she allowed them to slip in Jacques Delors, who was not a governor of any central bank, as chairman of the committee. And that was far worse.
Pour moi, c'était une tâche qui s'ajoutait à celle déjà lourde de président de la Commission, mais comment refuser ce défi et cette possibilité de faire avancer les choses?
With all the benefit of hindsight, it was a mistake. Perhaps we should never have agreed to a committee. I don't think we can actually have prevented a committee being appointed. But it was a great disappointment. Central bank governors under the lash of Delors in the chair. And that was the real mistake, to let Monsieur Delors have the chair of that committee. Put on a turn of speed which few would have thought them capable of.
Who proposed that, though, that you should be the chairman?
Le chancelier Kohl.
Unaware of what Kohl had let her in for, Thatcher was still relying on the normally cautious Germans to help block a single currency. But the result of Hanover was to speed everything up. Delors' committee drew up a three-stage plan for monetary union. This would later be written into the Maastricht Treaty. Thatcher had known Kohl for some years. Though both conservatives, she had little rapport with him or love for the country he led. This was potentially damaging.
Chancellor Kohl realized that. And at one time, when we were in Williamsburg, on a non-European summit, he took me aside in the men's loo. Happily, there was an interpreter on parade, and said, "Why don't you tell Margaret to try wooing people a bit more than she does, Geoffrey?" Because he'd seen a brush-up between herself and President Mitterrand. And I took the opportunity of passing the message through.
At times she tried to woo Chancellor Kohl, but wooing was frankly not a Thatcherite diplomatic tool. She was more inclined to lecture and to convince people by the strength of her will.
But Kohl was a bit of a romantic at heart. Wooing was what diplomacy was all about. In the spring of 1989, he invited Thatcher to Sunday lunch in his home region of Germany, close to the French border. He took her to his favourite restaurant in the village of Deidesheim. Kohl hoped that the way to her heart was through the stomach.
Ja, Bundeskanzler Kohl sagte zu mir, Manfred, hör zu, wenn Megisetti herkommt, musst du natürlich gucken, dass du was Regionales auf den Teller bringst. Also nicht irgendwas Französisches, Italienisches, sondern ich möchte hier die Region präsentieren, zeigen und deswegen soll es was Regionales sein.
They had called in German Saumagen, which is kind of pig's stomach, which is stuffed with all sorts of goodies. It's a rather heavy meal, but it's quite good, actually. I don't think Mrs. Thatcher really relished it very much.
His pub was very attractive. Unfortunately, we had his favourite dish, which was pig's stomach, which appealed greatly to him, which didn't appeal very much to Mrs. Thatcher, who chased it rather anxiously around the plate with her fork and then tried to conceal it under her knife and fork, I noticed.
Poor Helmut. His date was determined not to enjoy herself.
I think the entire population had turned out to greet Margaret Thatcher, and they burst into song, as Germans are apt to do, and I was saddened a little bit, because I don't think that the Prime Minister was as touched by this scene as I was. I don't think it touched her heartstrings.
She grew up at a time when Germany was the enemy, when Hitler was invading the Rhineland. I think that developed in her a feeling that Germany could never quite be trusted. Secondly, there was a more recent feeling that Germany wanted to get its way in Europe, and getting its way was not always in tune with our interests.
Kohl knew that German power was growing and that frightened everyone. That afternoon he took Thatcher to Speyer Cathedral to listen to some Bach. Kohl's message was that closer European Union would mean less German national power. But Thatcher thought it would mean precisely the opposite.
In the crypt are the tombs of some of the early Holy Roman Emperors. While Mrs. Thatcher was admiring these visions of an earlier European unity, Chancellor Kohl took me off into a corner and said, "Look, now she's seen me in my part of Germany, by the French border, surely she will finally understand that I'm not German, I'm European." So I said, "Well, Chancellor Kohl, I'll do my best." And off we went back to the aeroplane to take us back to London. And as we went into the plane, Mrs. Thatcher sat down, threw herself back in her seat, kicked off her shoes and said, "My God, that man is so German."
Suddenly, Thatcher's nightmare of resurgent German power became reality. The Berlin Wall came down. Thatcher was thrilled to see communism collapse, but she was unprepared for its inevitable consequence, reunification of Germany.
She was led to believe by people who should have known better, like President Mitterrand and Mr. Gorbachev, that it was possible to stop this. They were playing with the idea. She was not.
This was a crucial moment for Europe. Mitterrand soon adapted to the new reality. Thatcher never could.
I thought this was unreal. I mean, here was something which British governments of all parties had backed, favoured, for donkey's years, German reunification. Here was Chancellor Kohl. This was the objective of his life. And it was quite clear that she was doing her best to make it difficult.
Privately, the Chancellor was upset He was surprised how reluctant she was. Not only reluctant, later on much more outspoken.
Kohl would never forgive her. He and Mitterrand decided to solve the German question by pressing for early political and economic union, anathema to Thatcher. At the Rome summit in 1990, the Franco-German axis once again squeezed Thatcher out. She was isolated. She had no friends in Europe and had been weakened by cabinet resignations at home. It was the beginning of the end.
Statement from the Prime Minister.
She came back, made a statement in the House of Commons, but as always with her, what counted was not the statement she made, but how she answered the supplementary questions afterwards.
27th and 28th of October.
Yeah, my heart was constantly in my mouth at that stage.
Chairman or the President of the Commission, Mr. Delors, said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community, he wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no.
Her celebrated no, no, no was so manifestly a declaration of defiance and, if you like, of UDI on her part and on prospectively on Britain's part. It was that which finally led to my conclusion that I couldn't stay in the same team any longer.
I find Winston Churchill's perception a good deal more convincing and more encouraging for the interests of our nation than the nightmare image sometimes conjured up by my right honourable friend, who seems sometimes to look out upon a continent that is positively teeming with ill-intentioned people, scheming, in her words, to extinguish democracy, to dissolve our national identities, to lead us through the back door into a federal Europe.
Politics is a rough old trade. Of course it wasn't comfortable listening to Jeffrey's resignation speech. I was sorry he had resigned. I think the government was the weaker because he had resigned. But sometimes these things happen.
Yes, indeed. And funny how they end up. Michael Heseltine promptly challenged Thatcher's leadership, saying the issue was Europe, but it was Major who would benefit.
Mrs. Thatcher, could I ask you to comment?
Thatcher was in Paris, on the old enemy's territory, when news of the betrayal in London came in.
You must go and do some telephone.
Do you feel at all betrayed?
The poisoned chalice had claimed its most eminent victim.
Il semble que la question européenne ait pris une importance considérable. J'ai été un peu surpris. Pas beaucoup surpris, mais un peu surpris.
It wasn't that Thatcher didn't have a coherent vision of Europe, but she was its least effective advocate.
Being the awkward squad did become counterproductive. The sort of blitzkrieg approach at the beginning, when she was able to take the others by surprise, became progressively less effective.
It wears out a bit. I think that quite a lot of her colleagues began to regard it as theatre. I had that quite strong sense. They liked it, and they missed her when she'd gone, because they missed the excitement of it.
Ultimately, it reached the paradoxical and unfortunate position where she was a great unifying force, unifying Europe against Britain's interests, often very legitimate interests. You've got to be prepared to do deals, and there was nothing being achieved.
Britain now had a new general, John Major, who felt there were lessons to learn. He was no federalist, but he spoke warmly of Britain being at the very heart of Europe. You would never have called Mrs. Thatcher saying that. The cabinet found itself plunged into talks on a fundamental reshaping of the community, talks to which their departed leader had reluctantly agreed. When they were done, the Tory party would be split from top to bottom. European foreign ministers now started playing with new models of the community. The federalists were in the driving seat. But Douglas Hurd thought he'd got a good compromise for Britain. Foreign, defence and security policies would stay under national control. Only economic and trade matters would be directed from Brussels. Then the Dutch upset the apple cart.
The Dutch, being convinced federalists, became impatient with the way the negotiation was going. The compromise was emerging. And they tried to persuade everybody to scrap all that and to start on a new, clean Dutch draft, which was clearly federalist, which clearly moved things steadily, everything towards the centre.
Sometime in September, I think it was, my opposite number, who's a chap called Pete Dankert, telephoned me and said, look, we have done some work on the treaty and I'd like you to see this text. I think you'll be very pleased with it, I think he said. And it came over, I think, by special messenger, I can't remember. What I do remember was reading it at home that night and being very, very, very angry indeed. I had a pretty rough conversation with Pete over the telephone, and the Dutch press said that I had to be peeled off the wall of the Foreign Office, and that is not an exaggeration.
But people who basically agreed with them knew that, like the Luxembourgers and the Italians, knew at that stage that we would never accept, and that others wouldn't accept. The French wouldn't accept our foreign policy. And so they said to the Dutch, sorry, brave try, no go.
Round 1 to Major. But still on the agenda were a single currency and what was called the social chapter, two issues which could split Major's cabinet, let alone his party, and they would both come to a head in Maastricht. Maastricht is an old Dutch town, the place where the gunpowder plot to blow up the Palace of Westminster was hatched. Same town, same plot in some eyes, but not Major's. As European leaders gathered in December 1991, he was confident that he could win a British opt-out from the proposed single currency. He'd already got agreement on the principle, now he had to sort out the details. But not too soon.
I didn't want concessions made to me upon that issue that would have made the rest of my negotiations more difficult. I wanted that left till last.
The talks on a single currency were handled by Norman Lamont and other finance ministers. Much to the irritation of his colleagues, Lamont always takes full credit for clinching the opt-out.
The British opt-out was not resolved until the last minute, and what happened was I just produced a piece of paper at the last meeting deleting everything and saying it didn't apply to Britain. And to my intense irritation, although I'd said it was not acceptable, they went through it line by line, trying to alter it line by line, and I said that's not acceptable. None of this can be altered. Take it or leave it. And in the end they took it.
That was something you did, it was not the Prime Minister's.
No, I did that.
Well, I'm very surprised to hear Norman say that, and so will everybody else be who was actually there at the Maastricht negotiations. I think there will be some surprise amongst the officials and others who were there.
In dispute is a critical moment in the finance ministers' meeting, when Lamont walked out with the whole Treasury team. Lamont thought this was a devilishly clever ploy. His colleagues thought he'd got things badly wrong and put the opt-out in jeopardy.
Mr. Koch, the Dutch finance minister who was in the chair, it was not terribly helpful. I've got to say, at one point I walked out of the negotiations.
A very, very senior Treasury official who was on the team came up to me and said, Minister, the Chancellor has left the meeting. He's walked out and he's taken all of us with him. And our opt-out is actually now being discussed by others and we're not there. And that was really quite a major crisis because by then everything else was falling into place.
After walking out, Lamont discovered that Major and the Dutch Prime Minister, Ruud Lubbers, had gone into private session. They were trying to succeed where the finance ministers had failed. Time was running out, and Lubbers, as chairman of the summit, wanted a result. Lamont stormed down, desperate to get in, but Tristan Garel-Jones and the British ambassador to the community were guarding the door.
Norman Lamont arrived, wanted to go into the meeting. I mean, naturally he's in a state of some agitation. And we had to say, and of course it's embarrassing, John Kerr's an official, I'm Minister of State, he's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Chancellor, you can't go into the meeting. We had to be quite firm about that. You can't go in.
What did he say?
I think he was tense about it, I think, and then he left.
The final deal was done with Lubbers and myself. That is when the final deal was done, and those were the people who did the deal.
Were the finance ministers involved in the deal?
The finance ministers had been involved in the deal earlier in the day. The deal was finally done at that meeting. Finally agreed that that would be the way we proceeded at that meeting.
Major went on to get a second British opt-out, staying out of the social chapter, which harmonised benefits and employment law. He held out to the small hours, but his style of brinkmanship was very different from Thatcher's.
Major listened. He tried to understand the arguments he was up against. And then he used his own argument, and he could be stubborn as well, but he tried to listen. And it was much easier to get into a dialogue with him. In Maastricht, he certainly came out with, well, what he had come for.
Just as everyone was getting up to go now and sort of grab a glass of champagne, he switched on his button again. And, you know, there's a lot of sort of body movement there, and I thought, God, they're going to wring his neck this time. And he then made a very, very gracious and clever little speech. By then, Chancellor Kohl was sort of guffawing in his seat. I can't remember what he said, but he said something like that. Look, I'm the youngest person here. This is my first council meeting or whatever. And I'm very grateful. And he did it with skill and charm and all that, and then they all applauded him. So it actually ended with J. Major Esquire, you know, being congratulated by all these great European leaders.
Major still regards Maastricht as a triumph. He felt he'd turned the federalist tide that had been flowing since the Single European Act. Maybe so, but it didn't stop trouble at home.
I did feel great distaste for the whole thing. I never felt this is a positive achievement. I merely felt we had fended off something that I thought was terrible. And I remember coming back to London and a friend congratulating me, and I said, whatever on?
Some of those who had indeed been party to the negotiations themselves, and who had expressed themselves to me personally on more than one occasion as regarding this as a very good deal for Britain, I'm bound to say that some of their subsequent attitudes surprised me a little, yes.
You're thinking of Norman Lamont?
Well,
The treaty was signed, but before it could come into effect, each member state had to ratify it. If any country failed to ratify, the whole treaty would fall. It was not in Britain, but Denmark, where Maastricht started to unravel. In June 1992, the Danes voted narrowly to reject the treaty in a referendum. That gave Eurosceptics in Britain fresh heart. Stepped forward an obscure Tory backbencher, Bill Cash. After the 1992 election, Major's majority was much reduced, so the Eurosceptics were powerful. Cash and his fellow rebels felt certain Major would now grab the chance to drop parliamentary ratification of the treaty. Hadn't plucky little Denmark shown the way?
There was not unanimity, and therefore the treaty had to be renegotiated. I was absolutely thunderstruck when the Prime Minister said that they were going ahead. Had the opportunity been taken then, an enormous amount of pain and suffering would have been avoided.
We have no wish whatsoever to slam the doors in the face of Denmark or rule out any procedures whatsoever that will help Denmark in her present difficulties.
I was very surprised that the decision was taken. It was taken very quickly early in the morning by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, and announced by the Foreign Secretary on the Today programme.
Yes, that's correct. It was decided by us the morning afterwards on the advice of the whips, and in fact because there was no practical alternative. Not much point in calling a cabinet to discuss something for which there's no practical alternative.
Douglas Hurd went on to a crisis meeting in Oslo, where European foreign ministers decided to give the Danes a little longer to discover how wonderful the Maastricht Treaty really was.
It is wrong technically to argue that the treaty was dead. It was not dead, because the Danes said, we need time to be able to ratify it. What Ellemann Jensen said was, We need time and robust allies.
I, of course, said to them, if you start to squeeze me now, you will get some reactions that you don't like. So let me have some time to change the mood in Denmark and show me the robustness that is necessary in order to get that time. I got it.
Robust allies were just what Major needed a few months later. In 1990, Britain had entered the exchange rate mechanism, a sort of halfway, half-hearted move to monetary union. The pound was pegged to other European currencies, but now it was crashing. Major was keen to stay in, but guess who had to hold the line?
There are going to be no devaluations, no leaving the ERM. We are absolutely committed to the ERM. That is our policy.
Lamont turned to the Germans for help. If they cut their interest rate, sterling might be rescued. They said 9.
I had appealed to the Germans for them to relax their monetary policy, which I felt was crucifying us. I tried to persuade them, sometimes in the name of Europe. I'm not a great believer in European monetary cooperation, but if you did believe in it, I felt the Germans would have been advised to have helped us. But actually, the reality was they put their national interests before us.
Lamont concedes defeat. Britain withdraws from the exchange rate mechanism. Markets in chaos. Interest rates are 2% higher.
Nothing that Lamont had tried had made any difference.
It was rather like being in one of those television series, Casualty or Emergency Ward, and the patient is there and his heart is being recorded on a monitor, and you press a button and suddenly it's dead flat. It was exactly like that, and I knew the patient had died.
And so, shortly, would Lamont's cabinet career. The Germans, the new masters of Europe, had not gone the extra mile to save the pound, though a few weeks later they propped up the French franc.
Certainly the events of Black Wednesday, the accusations which flew around for a few days after that about the extent to which we were helped or hindered by our partners, of course, I mean, all that was extremely damaging, absolutely no doubt about that.
But the sterling fiasco was wonderful for the Eurosceptics. By the time Parliament started to debate Maastricht, they were riding high. Meanwhile, Labour, which was in favour of the treaty, played cynical politics on the first key vote. They decided to vote against the government. Defeat stared Major in the face.
About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, our intelligence services indicated that we were going to win quite handsomely, and it might have been as many as 10 or 11, the majority. But as the afternoon and the evening progressed, disappear, and you could see from the looks in their eyes that they hadn't got quite the same conviction that they had earlier on in the day.
I was rather enraged by this, so I decided, as they were going to rat, that I would re-rat, as it were. And so I went to my whip about 2 hours before the vote and said I decided not to abstain and was going to vote against. That caused a great panic. I was first of all asked to see the chief whip, and then I was asked to see the Prime Minister.
We were all at the sidelines watching a government in absolute turmoil. You know, cabinet ministers in corners browbeating poor little government backbenchers. You know, the Prime Minister standing, desperately pleading with these obscure people that nobody had ever seen before to support him in the lobbies.
He was extremely courteous, but failed to persuade me, although he told me at that point that he thought the government would be defeated and that he would resign.
If I'd lost that vote, I don't think the government would have been able to continue.
Even 6 months after winning the election?
We had given our word. We had given our word. A British government had given its word. I happen to regard that in international negotiations as rather an important matter, and I had made that clear to people at the time.
By just 3 votes, Major was on the way to honouring his promises.
319. The noes to the left, 316.
But by also promising not to complete the process before the Danes, he guaranteed the party 6 months of bloodletting.
It was quite an exhilarating experience. Rather like when one was at boarding school in my youth, if a group of you were all beaten together for some minor offence. It gave one a sort of collective sense of camaraderie which survives after half a century.
There was a night that will live in my memory when one of the government rebels came into our lobby and said, "I'm very sorry, George," he said, "we've only 26 voting with you tonight," he said, because one guy got stuck in the tube. And I thought this was less than a year from the great election victory, and here was a Tory MP apologising to me because he could only deliver 26 Tory MPs to the Labour lobby.
As 6 months of debate ground to a close, the government suffered a crushing defeat.
The ayes to the right, 3-1-6. The noes to the left, 3-2-4.
To avoid having to resign, Major had to get a vote of confidence the following day.
Parliament must put this stalemate over Europe behind it. I am not prepared to let it poison the political atmosphere any longer. The boil must be lanced, and it must be lanced today.
The Tory rebels fell into line and the Maastricht Treaty was finally ratified. But the Labour front bench felt pretty smug.
The Labour Party strategy had been to wreck the government, but not wreck the treaty. We had significantly opened wounds in the Conservative Party, from which I think they will take maybe half a century to recover from, and we kept our European credentials absolutely secure.
What was so frustrating about that episode was that there was a very large majority in the House of Commons for the agreement that I had reached in Maastricht. The Labour Party and the Liberal Party overwhelmingly supported it. And many people in the Labour Party in the early 1970s had voted for their principles on Europe. During the passage of the Maastricht Bill, the Labour Party did not do that. They voted for their own political interests and against the principles that they believed in.
I think there was an error of judgment in allowing as much time as people wanted to debate it. Mrs. Thatcher knew how to do it. She shoved through the single act, basically had us sitting up all night on a Thursday, cut down the debating time, and in theory it was much better for democracy what was done, but it was probably worse for the Conservative Party.
I suppose in retrospect we might have considered whether we should have forced it through very quickly, very speedily. But I'm not sure on an issue that has that sort of importance that it would necessarily have been the right thing to do. I think the scars and bruises of having done that would have been very real as well.
It did distract from government in the broad sense, and it also meant that in terms of morale, you know, the party was bleeding to death for 9 months, a year.
And the blood just continued to flow. In 1994, Major withdrew the Conservative whip from 8 rebel MPs.
I think the feelings were, so long as these silly Eurosceptics are out of touch or out of date, are having their little thing and holding their votes, don't worry about them, they mean well. When, in fact, we were dangerous, then understandably the party became very nasty.
But some Eurosceptics got nasty too. In summer 1995, Major met a large group of them and tried to butter them up. But it all went wrong. They thought he was intransigent, he thought they were rude.
I think he upset some of the group by not really shifting his ground at all. I think 1 or 2 people did indicate, while he was still speaking, that he wasn't persuading them. There's no doubt that the Prime Minister, as a result, I think, largely of the reports of the meeting, decided that his position had been challenged to a point at which he needed to seek a new mandate.
It was an irritable meeting, and to that extent it was a factor.
John Major resigns as leader of the Conservative Party and challenges his party critics to fight him for the top job.
I am not prepared to see the party I care for laid out on the rack like this for any longer. To remove this uncertainty, I have this afternoon tendered my resignation as leader of the Conservative Party.
For the umpteenth time, Major was trying to lance the boil. To his great surprise, the Eurosceptic who ran against him came from inside the cabinet itself. John Redwood gave him a run for his money.
For John Major, 218. For John Redwood, 89. I declare John Major elected.
Major's victory brought him a few weeks' relief. But as his Commons majority drained away, Europe remained the political detonator of Westminster. The flashpoint was not a single currency or a federal Europe, but the tainted roast beef of old England. Europe's ban on British beef exports prompted Major to go further than Thatcher ever had. He would veto anything and everything in Europe he could.
That without progress towards lifting the ban, we cannot be expected to continue to cooperate normally on other community business.
The Tory backbenchers, the tabloid press, even Major himself had no trouble identifying the enemy. It was Germany again. And that's where it all started. The European Union was forged to prevent its members ever fighting each other once more. But there's a paradox. The further away we get from real war, the harder it is to find the will to make Europe work.
Twice in this century, we have had wars that spread right the way across the world that started here in Western Europe. It is inconceivable that that could ever happen again. And one of the principal reasons for that, the principal reason for that, is the development of the European Union over the past 50 years. That is an incalculable prize. It is worth some of the discomforts and frustrations we all have with the European Union.
All well and good, but it hasn't prevented those frustrations driving Major's European policy.
The romantic days when we were sort of struggling for Britain to join Europe, that's all over. So most of us now, I would say, are Eurosceptic. The trouble, I think, with some Eurosceptics is that there is a hidden agenda there, which is that they don't really want Britain to be members of this thing at all.
This determination to press on to political union is in fact going to lead to a breakup, precisely because they are trying to impose, through stealth and deceit and various other means, the idea of political union without the full consent of the British people.
The continental dream of political union is something which no serving Prime Minister has felt the British public would swallow. From the start it's been, let's tell them about that some other day.
In the end, if you've got a difficult thing to put forward, it is best to put it forward honestly and straightforwardly. And I think the British government would have done much better to do that way back in 1961, but they didn't. And all British governments ever since have pursued the same line.
However they handle it, the European issue keeps coming back to wreck their little games.
The trouble with Britain's relations with Europe has always lain with the politicians and not with the public. If you try and play it on a purely party political basis, then you won't play a strong hand in Europe, and the prime ministers and other party leaders will suffer great damage to their own position. That's been the history over decade after decade after decade, and nobody ever seems to learn.